And hello, Hearts of Oak. Thank you so much for joining us once again with a guest that I've had the privilege of being on her show. Goodness, it seems like a regular occurrence 4 or 5 times, and that's Chanel Ryan. Chanel, thank you so much for your time today.
Well, thank you for having me on, Peter. It's such a pleasure. We love having you on Fine Point. You are always such a refreshing perspective, so that's what we're always looking for with the show.
It's always good to join you and bring something, whatever I can bring to you. But people can obviously follow you at Chanel Ryan on Twitter, on X. And we're going to get into the National White House Correspondents Association, which is there, NWHCA.press. We'll get into all of that. And of course, Fine Point with Chanel is every weekday, 9 p.m. Eastern on OANN. So make sure and plug in to that. Now, before we get on to this new venture, and I saw a video you put up recently, you said covering for the Biden family hospice and pill popping Kamala. I love that line. But step back a little bit. Your time in the White House in that media scrum. How did you end up there with OAN?
It's hand of God, really. I never started off life or my sentient, vision for the future on the track of media. I had originally planned to go to law school. I was very interested on the policy side of the way that the world works, and I never dreamed I would be in media. And my origin story in the world of media is, I tell younger people all the time, is testament to the fact that you should always be open to opportunity. And when doors open for you, there's a reason that doors are opening. And sometimes you should just go ahead, take the leap, walk through the doors, even if it's not part of the plan. And that was certainly my origin story. We had, my family was always involved in politics from a perspective of watching it. We weren't a sports family growing up. We, every 4 years, would travel up to New Hampshire from Texas just to participate in witness in the New Hampshire primaries every 4 years. In doing so, we would get to shake the hands inside diners of every candidate on both sides, Republican and Democrat. So I grew up in a family that loved politics, loved watching it, tracking it, understanding it, talking about it. And that was my basic foundation. And then going into school, I studied international relations and religion and literature, again, fully aiming to go to law school afterwards. And I met my now husband in school. We ran away with one another, and we ended up sidetracking my law school ideas, and he went into politics officially. He ran for U.S. Senate in Missouri, and that was obviously not a winning campaign, but we certainly learned a lot about one another, and we emerged victorious in each other, not in the race, but learning a lot more about one another and what we wanted to do. And we found ourselves in D.C. one day. My husband was invited to a film screening for Dan Gabriel. He's a former CIA officer, case officer. He had made a film about the Middle East, and we were at this film screening at Trump Hotel, and we run into a man who we had seen on TV quite a lot, Neil McCabe. One American News' Neil McCabe. And he runs into us and he says, I met you guys on the New Hampshire primary trail. You guys were standing in line for the Trump watch party, which ended up being the Trump victory party. And like, yeah, we were standing in line for hours, and you ran up with an OAN mic and interviewed us. And he's like, I remember you guys because you were my first interview at OAN. So we get to catching up. He learns that my husband is quite the subject matter expert in naval affairs and says, I happen to be working on a story about the Navy. I would love your expertise on this for a story I'm working on. One thing leads to another. The following morning, we're at One American News Studios in Washington, D.C. And my husband, Cortland, gives this interview. It's phenomenal. I'm excited. I'm taking pictures in the background. And interview's over. And Neil McCabe walks out with Cortland and says, by the way, you wouldn't happen to be interested in working in news, perhaps we've got the spot. It's a weekend White House correspondent role. And my husband, being the very ever supportive man that he is, threw me in front of it and said, like, Chanel would be perfect for that role. My eyes were just aghast. I was adamant. I said, I've never been on camera. And Neil said, no, as long as you know how to write, you know how to have a sense of story, you can apprentice yourself and teach yourself how to be on camera. We can teach you to be on camera. And I showed up the next day for a screen test, and I was hired the same day by the president of the company. And it was from there I kickstarted this absolutely astounding journey through media. I was astounded with the preconceived notions that I ran into that were quickly dispelled. I ran into some other caricatures of the press that I confirmed for myself. And 6 months later, I broke the Ukraine-Biden corruption story in a way that no one had before. I traveled to Ukraine with Rudy Giuliani, and I interviewed in person the prosecutors general who were accusing Biden of corruption in Ukraine. No one had done that before. And that was 6 months into my job. I had literally just called up Rudy. I said, hey, if there are people we should talk to about this Russiagate story, give me the list of names. I'll start reaching out to them. And he did. And I started looking up these names and reaching out to these people. And they would return to me and say, well, the State Department has banned us from traveling outside of Europe, so we can't come to you. And that kickstarted that entire episode of me flying to Ukraine with Rudy. And sorry, from there, I was
doing a road trip, an international road trip with Rudy Giuliani. Sorry, that sounds like the whole film.
Oh, it absolutely it needs to be in a book, and I honestly I can't believe I haven't written a book about it yet. I should. But that road trip with Rudy Giuliani was absolutely another tale. We had safe houses involved. We had old secret lodges in Hungary that we were bunkering down in and getting officials to secretly come out to and interview with, because we were trying not to alert officials too broadly that we were getting this information. It ended up we did not plan to go to Ukraine initially, but it did end up becoming a situation where we realized our key witness, the person I really wanted to talk to, was Viktor Shokin, the prosecutor general of Ukraine. This is back in 2019, mind you. And Viktor Shokin had been that prosecutor general that Biden bragged about, said, I fired this guy, basically, on the threat of withholding $1 billion in U.S. aid. So we were trying to get that guy. He was in Ukraine. He couldn't leave. He said he was sick, all kinds of excuses. So we thought, well, what would it take to go to Ukraine? Rudy did not plan on doing it. It was a last-minute trip, and it resulted in us buying last-minute tickets on a commercial flight from Hungary to Kiev. And we bought the last 4 tickets on this commercial flight, meaning we were seated in the very, very, very back of this commercial plane. So I'm walking with my cameraman and Rudy and his entourage through this Ukrainian plane. Everybody knows who Rudy is at this point. The Russiagate story is going on in the United States. Ukraine is squarely in the middle of this conversation. And here we are, Rudy Giuliani and OANN, walking down this cramped plane to the very end, seated by the bathrooms. And it was from there we flew out to Kiev, and it was a grand adventure. We broke some pretty incredible stories out of that trip. And when I returned, I was promoted to chief White House correspondent from there. So I had been covering, at that point, I was only 6 months on the job, promoted to chief White House correspondent after my Ukraine story. And my White House correspondence days covered 2 years of Trump and 2 years of Biden.
Okay, so tell us, because obviously what you have launched now is part of all your experiences of back then and seeing the things that did work and the things that didn't. But what was that like, especially for OAN, a media company that was maligned and attacked because it was on the right and because it wanted to speak truth and didn't cozy up to the normal establishment media? What was that like being with OAN, kind of being different than everybody else?
You know, Peter, I was homeschooled all my life, and you know, over the course of living, you hear people throw the phrase out, it's like high school all over again. And I never understood, I was never able to understand that because I'd never been to high school formally. And my experience at the White House can best be summed up with just imagine the clickiest clique in a high school, essentially keeping you out, singling you out, pointing at you, jeering at you every time you walk in the room, sneering at you, whispering behind your back, literally like high school, like a bad caricature of a high school play. And though that clique is very protective of its clique, it demands that you kiss the ring. If you don't kiss the ring, then you're an outcast. And just imagine being the outcast at a very elite prep school or something with like a lot of cliques, but there's one clique you're supposed to be a part of. If you're not part of it, you're not part of the cool kids. And if you're not part of it, you're derided, pushed out. You know, all kinds of abuses are bestowed upon someone who doesn't play the game. And as someone who never necessarily grew up in a world that wanted to be a part of the game, it was so easy for me to reject all of that. It was very easy for me to walk in knowing I was one of the most hated people in that room, knowing that they were going to do everything they could to kick me out, keep me out, prevent me from accessing what is otherwise known as the People's House. And it was an illuminating experience in the sense that it really taught me about people and how people don't really grow up.
So tell me, National White House Correspondents Association, where did the idea for that come from, and what kind of, how does it fit in to the new Trump White House?
That partly, it's not one of those things that you spontaneously wake up and say this has to happen. It comes from asking. National White House Correspondents Association, NWHCA, was born out of asking questions. And that question was this. WHCA the White House Correspondents Association is this 501c3 nonprofit. It's a private organization. It's a 501c3 run by a private organization. They had monopolistic power inside the briefing room. I saw firsthand how the White House press office was always bowing down to WHCA. And I just thought, being someone who is brand new to all of this, that that's how it works. There's this association, this group, and clearly it's been established by the White House, and clearly it's official, and clearly this is just how things work around here. I was quickly disabused of that when I tried to join WHCA. And they said, you may not join. We're not accepting your application. So I decided to go to the head of WHCA and ask him, like, hey, did I do something? I'm brand new to the scene. Am I just too junior? Is there things that I need to do? I don't know what I've done, but I've been rejected by your organization. But it raises a question of why. It seems like I've met every qualification requirement that you have listed in your website. I never get a response. And so, I'm sitting there curious as to how all of this works. And I think, wait a second, the WHCA decides who sits where. The WHCA decides who gets to have access to the president in the Oval Office. They also decide who accesses the president on Air Force One and who travels with the president. Isn't that something that the White House has a say in? Apparently not. So as I did my research, I found out the WHCA exists by tradition alone. Tradition. It was established in the Wilsonian era, and it's been around for 100 some years, and it's not. It really has these very archaic ideas about how the press interacts with the president. But bottom line is, this is a private organization. When I started doing my homework on it, I realized they have no jurisdiction in the White House. They have no jurisdiction to operate the way they have been operating for decades, and nobody has challenged them, ever. No one seems to have challenged them. It seems like there have been a handful of lawsuits filed here and there. But as far as an organization that maintains monopolistic control, seating arrangements, camera positions, who accesses the president, all in the hands of a single private organization that was largely left-leaning. I could not name, besides Fox News and maybe one or two other organizations, this was a left-leaning Democrat apparatchik that was holding monopolistic power inside the White House. And I saw filtering information that the public was gaining out of the Trump White House. So that, to me, was immediately a problem. I thought, this does not have to be this way. And just because they say for decades that they've been doing it this way does not mean it's proper. And so I wrote a big memo. In April 2020, April 2020, I separate from OANN, I filed all the documents to establish National White House Correspondents Association with the full intent on being a competing association that would be a home for conservative voices who are greatly, greatly underrepresented inside that briefing room. And I brought a very gigantic memo. I wrote a big memo, deeply researched, and I said, look, here's the memo. I walked it into the White House press office, and the press secretary at the time took it, and she was very enthusiastic. And she said, let me run this past a few people. And within a week, I checked back with her, and she said, the general counsel confirms what you say is true. WHCA does not have legal jurisdiction inside this ground, on the grounds of the White House. There's no law establishing that they decide who sits where. There's no formal agreement between the White House and the WHCA. Nothing. No authority for them to be there and acting the way that they have acted. We could go on for some of the other adventures we have run into, challenging their authority. But ultimately, the White House Correspondents Association saw me enough as a problem. They kicked us out of our seat, and they said it was for COVID reasons. That was bunk. I was clearly wearing a mask every single time. And they kicked us out of our seating assignment. And that's when the White House then personally invited me to stand in the back of the room without a seat. And it was once again another divine lesson. When your enemies try to strike you down, you only rise up stronger. Where the White House Correspondents Association members were only getting access to the briefing room every few days because I was personally invited, and now outside their jurisdiction, I was invited in the briefing room every single day. So where they had access every other day, while they're trying to kick me out, allowed me to get access to the White House every single day. It was a glorious time. And so those were the famous interactions where I was the girl standing in the back, roped off, taped off, shoved in the back. But I got questions every single day with Kayleigh McEnany or President Trump if he was in there.
So you've had all that experience, and now we're in a different time where, OANN, maybe one of the only voices really of reason at some of those press briefings. How do you see now that, because having a press pass, that's a high for the White House, that's highly prized. And now President Trump could open that. You could have correspondents for InfoWars, for War Room, for Tucker Carlson Network, and OANN, but it could completely change. It could be about hype, because President Trump went on lots of podcasts as well, and that opens up, and he realizes that the media have changed. So how does it kind of fit in reporting what's happening from that room, knowing that actually the composition will probably be completely different this time round?
It's going to change immensely, and I'm really I'm delighted that this idea has caught wind inside Trump world and the broader media world. And some media personalities don't cite this particular moment, NWHCA's formation, but this was really the moment that people started questioning why it is we do the things that we do in that briefing room. It'll change immensely. So it doesn't mean that all of a sudden we're opening the floodgates and every single Joe on the street can walk into the briefing room. That's not what NWHCA is all about. NWHCA is about simply ensuring that there is access to that briefing room. It's not filtered information. So, I'm proposing we split the room down the middle and let WHCA have half the assignments in that room, and NWHCA can have the other half. And obviously, 49 seats in there plus 20 maybe on each side. On some days you could squeeze in 60 people or more in that briefing room, standing and seated. Maybe way more. I'm sorry. It's been a couple of years since I've been in that room, but at times I think you would have up to 70 people in there, 80 even down the hall if you squeeze people down the hall. But no, it needs to be fundamentally reconfigured so that no matter what it actually looks like, Peter, it has to be a situation where the White House steps up and says, we no longer recognize the WHCA's monopolistic authority. WHCA can still exist. Yes, you guys still have correspondents, and obviously you are a private organization. You can do what you want, but you no longer have the authority to dictate in that White House briefing room who gets what seats, who sits where, and who has access to the president. Now, you still have to go through, if you want to access the press briefing room, you still have to go through a process. That's not going to change. You still have to pass a Secret Service background check. You have to have credentials of some kind saying that you are in the business of gathering news or gathering information. I think that part of the conversation may change slightly as we go into this next era, but you're right. New media is absolutely the future of media. New media is not necessarily the rigid building in a glassy, office in a glassy building with a news plaque over the door. Media means Joe Rogan, Tucker Carlson, as you mentioned, War Room. That the qualifications to get in, I think, will have to be measured by the White House and whoever's in charge. Bottom line, they need to decide what the qualifications are. But middlemen organizations like WHCA and NWHCA, we can help make the job easier, and that's what the role of an association should be. I'm advocating that NWHCA has cameras inside the press briefing room, that our members will have access to a representative who is assigned to them. If you are someone you're squarely in the podcasting category and you're an NWHCA member, well, then you have someone you email. If you have a question and you're out in Iowa, you email your representative at NWHCA who's going to be sitting in that room. I envision rotational representation as well. So we'll have someone who represents, medical media. There's an entire world and universe of people who cover medical news. Wouldn't that be nice to have learned people asking learned questions in the briefing room? We could have local representation. All of these ideas, obviously, again, are simply ideas, and it is contingent on the incoming White House recognizing they have the authority to recognize this. All they have to do is recognize that WHCA is not the only show in town. As soon as they recognize that, that gives NWHCA the leeway to then participate and help populate that briefing room so we have more representative media inside the room with access to the president.
Do you also think, and I'm not making a pitch here, but actually, because there's so many issues worldwide, and President Trump getting in is about fighting for freedom globally. All the restrictions have been placed in the UK and Europe and many other places. There's an opportunity, and I've been blessed to be on with you a number of times, and with many other US individuals talking about issues that are in the UK or Europe that affect. And we live in a time where actually there's going to be an interesting bridge with a lot of populist parties in Europe. It's going to be a very friendly relationship, I think, where it wasn't before, originally with President Trump. But yeah, how do you see international media? Because it's, I think sometimes, this is how I perceive it, that that room can be more US focused, but there's going to be an interest. I mean, no one cared about Joe Biden for 4 years. People will care about President Trump, and there'll be a clamor to take that to the world and not just the US media.
You're absolutely right. And I remember one time I was in the briefing room and I was in my usual spot standing in the very, very back. And it was that famous day Rick Grinnell came out to oh gosh, he was conveying the good news that that a peace deal had been arranged between some Eastern Bloc countries. I believe it was Serbia, and it was a phenomenal press briefing. Most of the people in the room were all very heavy on the domestic policy side, which I've honestly been very partial to foreign policy. I believe the president, his seat should be his executive powers should focus on foreign policy, whereas Congress deals with domestic policy. So I was, partial to foreign policy stuff, but rarely did that briefing room ever sound any interest in discussing foreign policy, mostly because the people sitting in that room are not versed in it. They all went to journalism school and they focus on domestic policy, which is their audience's interest. But one day I'm standing back there and there's this gentleman, and he's from Serbia, and he doesn't quite know what to do. And he's getting into an altercation with someone inside the WHCA. And they basically tell him, you're not allowed to be here. And he says, this is a huge and monumental day for my country. I'm a visiting reporter. I would love to be able to report on this. And they said, sorry, you don't have a seat assignment, so you're not coming in. So I flagged him down. I chased him down Pebble Beach, and I said, hey, come stand with me. And if they give us grief, I'll step out. But clearly this is a relevant day for you, a reporter from the very country we're talking about, in the briefing room. And the WHCA was being absolute jerks. So I invited him in, and he was able to stand there and participate in that briefing. But I remembered that moment, and I vowed that NWHCA would ensure moments like that did not happen. When we know that some relevant issue, either around the world, foreign or domestic, is happening, we should ensure that experts or people who are from that region have an opportunity to at least participate or ask a question in there. And to your original question, as the UK becomes, in other places around the world, become interesting hotspots for news with US news, it's, I think, very beneficial to have representation for foreign correspondents. Now, WHCA already has that. I think they have 2 or 3 seats, if I remember, if they haven't changed that since I was there. They had 2 or 3 seats that were assigned to a foreign correspondent, and they would rotate that out. But, this is the 21st century. We don't have to say access is limited to a physical body being in a physical seat. You can either have a representative who's representing these different groups, or figure out a way to digitally allow people to access this stuff. But this is the 21st century, and we need to bring the briefing room into the 21st century as well.
Oh, absolutely. Chanel, I'm looking forward to seeing how the NWHCA develops and fits in. And obviously we're in a state of flux between that weird time.
I hope to count you as a member.
Well, I've signed up for emails anyway, and we'll see how it develops, and everything depends on how smoothly into 20th of January we go, and then after that. But thank you so much for giving us your time. I know you've got a lot on them. We haven't even touched on the crazy thing in drones, but I will have to watch your reports. The crazy times we live in. But thank you so much for coming on.
That's Peter. I'm going to leave you with the drones are ours, and they're looking for something. And I'm going to stick with that theory.
Uh, I'll be there with my. We can't have guns. We can't shoot things down here. So my air rifle, maybe in the UK. But thanks so much for giving us a little bit about your background.
Before I leave, though, I want to throw a hot take in here, and we can talk about this in future segments. But the drone issue, by the way, I think is a ripe ground for the Second Amendment. And it's the new Second Amendment discussion. No one's really talking about it, but it's the purpose of the Second Amendment is for the American people to be armed against our own government. And we are fast approaching a world where the United States government has access to technology, drones, that are weaponized in ways that really you would not differentiate them from the general purpose of being armed. And so I believe that the Second Amendment folks need to jump into this drone conversation. We do not have access to the kinds of technology that the government has, obviously, but it's the FAA is really over-regulating this stuff, and that's really going to be the new battlefield for the Second Amendment. But hot take, maybe we're too ahead of our times on that one.
We will see. Chanel Rand, thank you so much for giving us your overview of a whirlwind of your background in the media, in the White House, and looking forward to seeing how this develops into the new White House. So thank you, Chanel.
Thanks for having me, Peter. Always a pleasure.